What if I told you that right now Spain is quietly becoming one of the hottest and at the same time most confusing real estate markets in Europe? Because here's what's happening. Inflation in Spain has just jumped to around 3.2% as of early 2026, the highest level in months. And that might not sound dramatic at first, but here's the catch. This increase is being driven largely by rising energy cost, fuel, electricity, heating, which means one thing, the cost of living is creeping up again. Now, normally, higher inflation should slow down things, right? People spend less, investors hesitate, markets cool. But in Spain, the exact opposite is happening. Property prices are still rising and rising fast. In fact, in the first quarter of 2026 alone, housing prices jumped by over 40% year on year. Some data even shows increases above 20% annually in certain segments. Let that sink in. We have a situation where inflation is rising, living costs are going up, and yet real estate prices are accelerating. So what's going on here? Well, the answer is a mix of psychology, supply, and global demand. There's simply aren't enough properties. Experts point out that demand is still strong while supply remains limited, especially in popular regions and coastal areas. And when supply can't keep up, prices go up fast. But here's where it gets even more interesting. If you talk to people on the ground, buyers, investors, and even locals, you will hear two completely different narratives. On one side, you have investors saying this market is still undervalued compared to other European countries. Spain is a safe bet, tourism, lifestyle, international buyers, and honestly, they are not wrong. Hello everyone, Gregory here and welcome to Gregory's Economics, your economic channel. I am Gregory and this is another episode of daily series covering global economic news. Unfortunately, a lot is happening around the world right now, so we can skip any of today's topics. To our loyal viewers, I kindly ask for your support with a thumbs up as it really helps us a lot. So without further ado, let's get into it. Spain continues to attract foreign capital, remote workers, and lifestyle buyers looking for some lower cost and long-term value. But then there is the other side. Locals are starting to say it's getting too expensive. We are being priced out. This can't continue forever because while prices are booming, affordability is becoming a real problem, and that creates a tension in the market, a market that's growing but also stretching. So the big question is, are we looking at strong sustainable boom or the early signs of market that's overheating? Because when inflation rises and asset prices rise at the same time, something has to give. So now let's zoom out, because what's happening with inflation in Spain right now is not just a short-term spike, it's actually part of a much bigger story. Right now, inflation has climbed back to around 3.4%, mainly because of one thing: energy, fuel prices, electricity, transport costs. Everything connected to energy is pushing prices up again, and of course cheap, very cheap loans. And this is important because just a few months ago inflation in Spain was actually going down. Now it's reversing, and according to economists this reversal was unexpected. So what happens next? Well, the forecasts are mixed. The central scenario from the Bank of Spain suggests inflation could average around 3% in 2026 and then gradually fall to about 2.5% in 2027. Sounds stable, right? But here's the twist. In a worst case scenario, if energy prices stay high, inflation could spike as high as 5.9% in 2026. That's almost double. So we are basically looking at a market that is extremely sensitive to one variable: energy. And that brings us the most controversial question right now. What about VAT on fuel? Because because here's what the government did to fight inflation. Spain cut VAT on fuel from 21% to 10% as part of an emergency package. This move reduced fuel prices, saved drivers money, helped slow inflation temporarily, but this policy is temporary, and unless it's extended, VAT is expected to go back to 21% around mid-2026. So what happens if that actually happens? Simple. Fuel prices go up again, and when fuel goes up, transport becomes more expensive, goods become more expensive, and inflation goes up again. It's a chain reaction, and this is exactly what media and analysts are warning about. Many reports say governments across Europe are under pressure. They either keep subsidies and tax cuts and increase public debt, or they remove them and risk another wave of inflation. There's no easy choice. Now, what about people? Because this is where things get really interesting. On one side, you have optimism. Some people believe this is temporary. Energy prices will stabilize. Spain has handled crises well before, and to be fair, Spain is still growing economically and benefiting from strong tourism. But on the other side, there's growing anxiety. People are noticing fuel prices rising again, everyday costs creeping up, and uncertainty about what happens after summer. And the biggest concern is this: if the government removes support, everything gets more expensive overnight. So right now, Spain is basically standing at a crossroads. Either extend support and keep inflation under control, or remove it and risk a second inflation wave. And that decision could directly impact not just daily life, but also real estate market we talked about earlier. Because when inflation rises again, everything changes. Now let's go back to the real estate market, because this is where things get really paradoxical. On the surface, everything looks simple. Yes, property prices in Spain are rising, and not just slightly. In many areas, especially coastal regions, big cities, and popular expat destinations, prices have been climbing at a double-digit pace. Places like Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Malaga, these markets are hot. Demand is strong, foreign buyers are active, and supply is tight. So naturally, prices go up. But here's where the story completely flips. Because while part of Spain is booming, another part of Spain is quietly collapsing. There are thousands, actually tens of thousands of properties across the country that are extremely cheap. We are talking about houses for 10k, entire homes selling for less than a used car, villages where you can buy property for almost nothing. Why? Because large parts of Spain are depopulating. This phenomenon is often called empty Spain or España vacía. In many rural areas, young people leave for cities, jobs disappear, infrastructure declines, and entire towns slowly fade away. So what happens to real estate in those areas? Prices don't just stagnate, they collapse, and this creates one of the most unusual real estate dynamic in Europe. In the same country, at the same time, you can have overheated markets with rising prices and ultra cheap properties with almost no demand. It's like two completely different realities. Now, what are people saying about this? Some investors see opportunity. They say this is the last chance to buy cheap land in Europe. These areas will recover long term. With remote work, people will move back. And yes, there are small signs of that happening, but many locals and experts are much more skeptical, because the truth is, cheap property doesn't always mean a good investment. In many of those depopulating areas, there are no jobs, limited healthcare, poor transport connections, and very low liquidity, meaning it's hard to sell later. So even if a house costs 15,000 euros, you might not be able to sell it at all. And that's the risk most people don't talk about. So when you hear real estate in Spain is booming, that's only half the truth. Because Spain is not one market, it's two markets moving in completely different directions. And understanding that difference is everything. Now let's step back and look at a bigger picture. Because everything we talked about, inflation, energy prices, real estate, it all connects to one key question: what is actually happening with the Spanish economy and its debt? Because if you look at the numbers right now, Spain is surprisingly strong position. Economic growth is still solid. The Bank of Spain expects the economy to grow by around 2.2%, 2.3% in 2026, which is actually much higher than the Eurozone average. That's driven by strong tourism, solid consumer spending, population growth. So from the outside it looks like Spain is doing very well, but here's where it gets more complex. Let's talk about debt. Spain public debt is still high, around 100% of GDP. Now normally that sounds dangerous, but here's the key detail most people miss. That number is actually going down. After peaking above 120% during 2022, Spain has been gradually reducing its debt ratio year by year, and forecasts show it could fall below 100% in 2026, around 97-98% by 2027-2028. So technically, yes, Spain is reducing its debt, and it's doing it in a very specific way, not by cutting spending aggressively, but by growing the economy faster than the debt. This is crucial because economists say as long as economic growth stays strong and interest rates remain manageable, debt can slowly shrink over time. So does that mean debt is no longer a problem? Not exactly, because here's the reality. Even though debt is falling, it's still high and vulnerable. Institutions like the IMF warn that Spain's debt path is sensitive to shocks, especially things like higher interest rates, slower growth, or another energy crisis. And there's another long-term issue nobody talks about enough: aging population, more pensions, higher healthcare costs, more pressure on public finances. In fact, the long-term projections suggest that without reforms, debt could start rising again in the future. So we are looking at a very interesting situation. In the short term, Spain looks stable, growth is solid, debt is slowly decreasing, but in the long term, there are serious structural risks, and this leads to the most important takeaway: Spain hasn't solved its debt problem, it has managed it for now, and that's exactly why markets are still confident, but also why economists remain cautious, because if growth slows down or inflation forces higher interest rates, this entire balance can shift very quickly, and when that happens, it doesn't just affect the economy, it affects real estate, investment, and everyday life. If you found this episode valuable, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future content posted here every day. I also recommend checking out other interesting videos you see on your screen next to this one, along with the subscribe button. Greetings to everyone on this beautiful sunny day, and see you next time.